Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to our discussion on the Jacksonian era. So from 1800 to 1840, states removed property and tax restrictions, and the removal of these things allowed 90% of what we would consider the common white men to vote. And it really takes away the restrictions of you have to own such and such amount of property, or you have to have a certain amount of wealth to be able to vote. And unfortunately, this leads to only universal white male suffrage. At this point, African Americans are still slaves, and women don't have the same rights as the men do. Andrew Jackson's victory in the election of 1828 really changes American politics. And he had been a poor boy growing up in Tennessee, and so he's really seen as like a common man. And he comes in as a war hero from the Battle of New Orleans, and that's really popular for like the regular voting public. But Jackson comes in and he gets over 50% of the popular vote, and even more of that in electoral college votes over John Quincy Adams. And Jackson's background is really poor boy from Tennessee, not formally educated. He's from the Western Territories, which is a really big deal in 1828 because all of our previous presidents had been from the eastern side of the country. And a lot of the people who vote for him see him as a representative of the common man, hero of the wars and man of the people, and he's just so great. But it's really that platform that skyrockets him into the presidency. Jackson's victory splits the Democratic Republicans, who have had a long victory, an almost 30-year victory in office. And this really leads to the formation of the Democratic Party, which we didn't have before. Remember, before it's the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And Jackson and his supporters hope to really return to the Jeffersonian ideas. And that's why we compare so often as historians the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian eras, because their policies and their principles and beliefs are very similar. And it's really because Jackson is similar mindset of Jefferson in the belief in the agrarian, normal people idea and belief in strong states' rights over federal rights, protection of liberty, and is a very strong advocate for westward expansion. I mean, the guy's from Tennessee, so that's pretty far west in that era. But during his 8 years in office, Jackson greatly expands presidential power. The opposition to Jackson leads to the formation of the Whig Party and return to the two-party system, because not everybody agrees with him like he hopes. And so if you look at our chart here, by 1820, we've got James Monroe, then John Quincy Adams. And at that point, you can see that it really splits into multiple vectors. So Jackson runs against Adams. So then you get the Democratic Party and the National Republican Party. But then an offshoot of the National Republican Party is the Anti-Masonic Party. And then you get this weird convergence between Magnum, Webster, White, and Harrison that ends up in the Whig Party. And then eventually the Liberty Party just kind of comes out of nowhere. So politics in this mid-19th century time frame, they're really complicated and very difficult to understand. But it's mostly the influence of Jefferson on Jackson that leads to the changes in these political parties. And so for the Democrats, our main leaders are Jackson, John C. Calhoun, Martin Van Buren, who also becomes president later down the road, and Thomas Hart Benton. And the political ideology of these four men is very Jeffersonian democracy, we the middling people, agrarian society, small federal government, and less restrictions on the economy. And so they believe that monopolies are bad. A monopoly is when one person or organization controls the entirety of an industry. Oddly enough, coming from Jefferson, they don't believe in privilege. They believe in low land prices and tariffs because they want that agrarian society where everybody owns the land and has all the crops and plantations and farms and all of that. But the main thing that they agree on is freedom from government interference. They're a very laissez-faire or lazy government. Whereas the Whigs, your Henry Clays and your Daniel Webster and your John Quincy Adams, and then William Henry Harrison, who also becomes a president later down the line, are very Hamiltonian, very federalist, strong central government, support for national banks, industrial economy. And so when Jackson enters office, he really encourages the use of what we call a spoils system. And what that means is basically he's appointing people to jobs within his administration based on the fact that they're his buddies, they're his friends, not because of what they can actually do. So he basically fires everybody from the Adams administration and replaces those people with people that believe the way he does. And the spoils system is also called patronage. And during this time period of the 19th century, patronage was seen as really democratic because it gives government jobs to new people and allows for regular people to have more of a influence on government. But over time, it really leads to inefficiency because these people aren't qualified to do their jobs. They don't actually know how to do their jobs in most cases. And it also leads to government corruption because some of the people that end up being put in office are gonna do low-key bad things. So think of it this way. Let's say that I come in and I'm real good friends with the principal. And because I'm good friends with the principal and I really need a job, he's going to give me the only opening on his staff. And that job is a math teacher job. Guys, I am not a math person. It's just not how my brain works. I would be no good at that because I don't understand it myself. And I'm not qualified for it. And so later, as we're going to move through, this ends up getting replaced by the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And that basically says that you would get a job based on what you can do instead of who you know. So in a situation like that, you have to take a test and prove that you know the content and the understanding of what needs to be done before you get that job. And that's not going to come until the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. So Jackson's two-term presidency, so he's president for 8 years, but he's got 3 major conflicts. And Jackson's presidency is just marred by conflict. The first one is tied very closely with his desire to move westward. He wants to expand the nation and expand our borders and to cultivate new land in the West. But that land is already occupied. Native Americans live there and have lived there for centuries. And so the 5, what we would consider civilized tribes, or that's what they called them at the time, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, in Jackson's mind, stood in the way of American expansion. They are already on this land, and it doesn't really belong to them because, well, I mean, it's American land. And at that time, Native Americans weren't American citizens. And so they're in his way. And then the Discovery Gold in North Georgia in 1828, that's kind of a symbol of, okay, now that's found on American soil, and I don't care if your people have lived there forever, it's American soil, so that gold belongs to us. And so that causes the government to seize Cherokee lands, which means they're going to take it away from the Cherokee people. And because of this, the Cherokee sue the state of Georgia in the Supreme Court case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And essentially what happens is the Cherokee Nation goes to the Supreme Court and asks them to determine whether a state can impose its own laws on Native Americans in their territory. And the Georgia legislature previously had passed laws that were designed to force the Cherokee people off of the land that had originally belonged to them. And the Supreme Court essentially refuses to rule on whether Georgia has the ability to do that. Instead, the court tells them that the Supreme Court and the federal government does not have jurisdiction over the case because the Cherokee Nation was considered a domestic dependent nation instead of a foreign state. So because they were their own dependent nation within the United States, instead of a foreign country, the Supreme Court couldn't say whether Georgia has the jurisdiction over them. So that's the first major issue. But Congress passed and Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And this forces all Native American tribes to relocate west of the Mississippi. And this results in what we know of as the Trail of Tears. And the situation becomes the Army forces the Cherokees to march west in horrible conditions. They're not well taken care of. Many die. And they force them off of their native land. And they force them to reservations in the Western Territories. And the Western Territory predominantly being like Oklahoma. So by the 1830s, sectionalism is also becoming really big. Sectionalism is the divide between the people who want slave states and the people who want free states. And it really comes down to an issue with tariffs. And a tariff is a tax on imports and exports. So the northern states favor these tariffs because they profit when people buy American-made goods, because the North is more industrial than the South. Now, this isn't meaning that the North is full of factories and they're, making all these things. The Second Industrial Revolution really produces more, but the North is significantly more industrial than the South. And so those people are taking the raw materials, creating goods, and then selling them overseas. So if they can sell those goods overseas, they're going to make more of a profit because of the tariffs, the taxes. So when Congress passes a high tariff in 1832, the southern states claim their states' rights were violated, because now that's going to mean less money for them. And they don't think that's fair. And so the tariff debate basically is saying, like, according to the southern states, like, this is protecting the North. Foreign-made goods are more expensive. If people buy more U.S. goods, the northern industrial states are going to profit from the increased business, and so the North is going to get richer. Vice President at the time, John C. Calhoun, threatened that South Carolina would nullify or ignore the unfair federal tax. So that basically means that he's just going to pretend like it doesn't exist. This becomes the Nullification Crisis. And southern states really oppose this because it makes goods more expensive even here in the country, and it leads to European tariffs on cotton because even though Europe is making more, in order to send their goods over to the United States, they're going to cost more because it's a tax on imports and exports. And so they're then going to in turn raise their taxes on the biggest southern export, which is cotton, which is going to then hurt the South. And so this comes down to president versus vice president. Calhoun supports nullification as a way for states to protect themselves from the national government. Very Jeffersonian of him. These tariffs are a federal government thing. We disagree with them, so let's just ignore it. Calhoun believed this was a last resort, and states could secede from the Union based on this decision. This is one of the first times that secession or leaving the Union really becomes a big thing. Jackson, however, doesn't support the tariff either. He doesn't think it's the greatest idea in the world, but he sees the nullification as a threat to the United States. If you start ignoring what the federal government's going to say, then you might as well just leave because you're completely ignoring the overarching government of the Union. And Jackson urges Congress to pass the force bill to enforce the tariff. So that would just kind of reinforce the fact that the tariff is law and the federal government makes that decision. Therefore, all states need to abide by it. The nullification crisis ends up coming to an end when Clay introduces a lower tariff. So as a means of compromising, Clay just comes in and is like, okay, so here's another tax. It's the same concept. We're still taxing. However, it's not quite as enforcive. It's not as forceful as the other one. And so it leads to the Compromise of 1833. And this conflict really reveals how bad the sectional tensions in the country have gotten. The debate between North and South, industrial versus agricultural. And the South really start using the states' rights trope to argue secession from the Union is actually possible. If you don't agree with us and we're not on the same page, like, we'll just leave. And we have the right to do that. Jackson is willing to use force to protect the power of the national government over the states, which kind of goes against his Jeffersonian belief because he's usually a very states' rights person. But as the President of the United States, he sees this as a necessary thing. And he's willing to use his power as the President to enforce this, even if it means going against his states' rights stance. The third conflict of the Jackson administration is his war against the Second Bank of the U.S. So Jackson thinks the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional, gives too much power to the elite, very anti-federalist. And in 1832, Henry Clay and a bank manager, Nicholas Biddle, support the rechartering of the Bank of the United States because it had been let to expire. The charter was gone, and Jackson vetoes the bank recharter. And that basically means that he says no. And the president does have that power under the Constitution. If he doesn't think that a law is good, he can veto it or say, nope, not doing it. And with his veto, the Bank of the United States is going to be gone in 4 years. And so a lot of people really, really disagree with this. So in 1833, Jackson orders all federal money to be removed from the Bank of the U.S. and put in the funds of 23 pet state banks. That basically means like banks that are controlled by the government, the federal. And without that Bank of the United States umbrella, banking went unregulated. There's no real control over the banking industry from 1833 to 1913. And within that time frame, the economy enters a number of panics or depressions where it's a downturn in the economy because of a lack of governmental regulation on the economy. Very anti-Hamiltonian. And this really also has maybe a hand, some historians say, in leading to the Great Depression, which comes a few years after this unregulation ends. Jackson represents a new era in American democracy. We just had 30 years of Democratic Republicans, so nearly 30 years of the same thought process. And he and the Democratic Party represented the will of the common man, which is good. His use of the spoil system, his veto power, and his stance against state rights strengthened the power of the president, which in some cases a lot of people see as too much power. And there's still people that are, still remember their parents or their grandparents talking about what it was like under King George III and all of the issues that led to the American Revolution in the first place. And so a lot of people really kind of see this strengthening of presidential power as Jackson leading to a monarch. And some of his, worst critics actually nicknamed him King Andrew I. And he has the power to veto, and he can just do whatever he wants. Opposition to Jackson leads to the formation of the Whig Party and the return of the two-party system, and a slew of other political parties as we move through the rest of the 19th century. But Jackson, he does some good stuff. He's got some good ideas, but in the end, his presidency is really marred with issues. And a lot of historians see him as kind of a villain in our history. It's like he doesn't really quite, even though he comes in with great ideas and a great stance, he's very Jeffersonian, he doesn't quite live up to that throughout his presidency. So this brings us to the end of our discussion on Andrew Jackson's administrations. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.